We have one more Sunday before Holy Week begins after this week. Throughout this season of Lent, we have been walking through Barbara Brown Taylor's An Altar in the World, off and on for most of the weeks. And we've been sharing some of the themes that she's talking about, which includes themes like the practice of saying no, the practice of being grateful, the practice of encountering others. It's practices that help us see and experience and encounter God even when we're not sitting in a pew, but recognizing that there are altars in the world, places where we're meeting with God all over the world, as close to us as within us, wherever we go, or in our physical homes, or on vacation, or in the woods, or in our relationships. And this morning, we're sharing about the practice of feeling pain. That sort of pain, no gain feeling that the kids were feeling. We're wondering how it is that we can practice pain. And the natural book to turn to for talking about pain is the book of Job. This reading today, the second reading from the book of Job, from this first chapter, is some of the oldest written scripture in the Bible. It's even older than the book of Genesis in the 6th century BCE. And before I actually do the reading, though, I want to just clear the table, because I feel like whenever Christian people or churches talk about pain and suffering, which is sometimes the main reason why people are religious, right? People feel pain or encounter struggle, and that's when they often turn to God. And so there's lots of teaching, and there's a wide spectrum of teaching on pain and suffering. And so with our table of expectations, I want to clear off a few things. First, this story is a story about a guy whose fate appears to be in the hands of God and a Satan figure. What I want us to not walk away from is some idea that each of us are faced with a fate of two opposite deities debating about how good or bad our life is, thinking that it's God who is seeking to test us with the things we're going through. These are not the expectations that we are coming to this text with. The author of Job was most likely a lot more interested in wrestling with pain and wrestling with our struggle, not trying to give us a historical depiction of what it is, how it is that God exists in the world. We can take off the table this assumption that God is sending us pain like Zeus with a lightning bolt, because this idea of testing Job was not God's idea in the first place. So with a clear space, and recognizing we're not called into pain, that God is not seeking for us pain, let's open our eyes to what God is teaching us through this text and how it is we might learn about how we can experience God through suffering. So this comes from the book of Job, chapter 1. A man in the land of Uz was named Job. That man was honest, a person of absolute integrity. He feared God and avoided evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 female donkeys, a vast number of servants. He was greater than all the people of the East. Each of his sons hosted a feast in his own house on his birthday. That's a big privilege, right? They invited their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had been completed, Job would send word and purify his children. Getting up early in the morning, he prepared burnt offerings for each one of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Job did this regularly. One day, the divine beings came to present themselves before the Lord. and the adversary also came among them. The Lord said to the adversary, "Where did you come from?" The adversary answered the Lord, "From wandering throughout the earth." The Lord said to the adversary, "Well, have you thought about my servant Job? Surely you've seen him. Surely there's no one like him on earth, a man so honest, a man of absolute integrity who reveres God and avoids evil." The adversary answered the Lord, "Does Job revere God for nothing? Haven't you fenced him in, his house and all that he has? Haven't you blessed the work of his hands so that his possessions extend throughout the earth? If you stretched out your hand to strike all that he has, he will certainly curse you to your face." The Lord said to the adversary, "Look, all he has is within your power. Just don't stretch out your hand against him." So the adversary left the Lord's presence. One day, Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans took them and killed the young men with swords. I alone escaped to tell you." While this messenger was speaking, another arrived, said, "A raging fire fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and devoured the young men. I alone escaped to tell you." And while this messenger was speaking, another arrived and said, "The Chaldeans set up 3 companies, raided the camels, and took them, killing the young men and swords. I alone escaped to tell you." And while this messenger was speaking, another arrived and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house when a strong wind came from the desert, and it struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell upon your children. They died. I alone escaped to tell you." Job arose, tore his clothes, shaved his head, and fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I will return there. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And in all of this, Job did not sin or blame God. May God add a blessing to the reading of this word. So I'm sure none of us quite have as extreme an example of pain and suffering as having all of this news just hit at once. Job is having that, what is that book, the no good, very bad day, sort of terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day situation. Not to make light of his experience, but I'm sure if we did a raising of hands, who of you have had a pretty no good, very bad day sometime in your life? Has anyone been through some pain and suffering maybe at some point? Of course, everybody has had suffering. Even if you are an especially privileged person, all of us stub our toe at some point. All of us have experienced sickness and sometimes really serious loss. Of course, this weekend, as I was writing this sermon, I was actually threw out my back pretty badly on a hike. So I would just warn you that preaching is very dangerous. If you get a preaching theme, then you know that something's going to happen that week that you encounter it. You only really want to preach on like joy and blessing as much as possible. This is a city of people who really understand pain. In the medical world in particular, so many people are coming here like it's the pool of Bethesda trying to seek healing. So many people who are medical professionals know that when they give that shot to that child or when they're trying to care for a patient, so many people are suffering. All of us know something about pain in this life. And in the U.S. in particular, we're a country that is especially full of pain, and we're not always sure how to deal with it in a healthy way. Mostly we throw a lot of drugs at our problems. There was a study by Johns Hopkins University and George Washington University where researchers found if you combine the healthcare cost to treat pain plus the lost productivity from people missing days of work and employment, chronic pain costs the U.S. healthcare system between $560 and $635 billion per year. And this is more than the cost of cancer, the cost of diabetes, or heart disease. And sadly, when we throw in all the heavy medicating we try to do to prevent and keep pain away, we have ourselves much addiction and a big crisis. There are over 130 people who die every day due to overdoses related to the opioid crisis. So we know we don't have the healthiest relationship with pain. And from our own experience, pain can just be excruciating and distracting. And sometimes it's a lot worse when it's not you suffering, right? When you're with loved ones or with your children while they're suffering and you have no control to take it away. It's a whole nother kind of suffering. So beyond our religious inclination to want to just pray the pain away, to want to show up at church just to pray to get rid of pain, how is it that we can come to have a healthier relationship with pain and come to a place where instead of just trying to get rid of it, we actually can encounter and experience God through our pain? Something I wonder about is that while we have this huge medical issue of trying to get rid of pains and try to prevent danger and make everyone safer and live longer in this obsession we have with our own health and safety, there are other people who throw themselves in the path of danger for seemingly no reason. Did anyone see the film that recently came out called Free Solo? Has anyone heard of this at least? A couple people? So there is a rock climber named Alex Honnold, and I also like rock climbing. I think it's very fun. But this guy, Alex, is sort of a crazy person. And this award-winning documentary that came out is talking about how Alex has this habit regularly, not all the time, but he has free solo climbs. And if you are a climber, you know that usually when you are climbing up something, even something as small as just a little over 6 feet, you usually strap on a harness and you strap on a rope. But Alex's preference is that every once in a while he climbs with none of that. He climbs with just his shoes and his clothes and his hands. And in particular, he climbs some pretty massive mountains, some pretty massive cliffs with this kind of free solo attitude. In particular, this movie, is his climb of El Capitan in the Yosemite Valley, which is a 3,000-foot straight-up rock. Watching the movie, and even just thinking about it now, my hands start sweating. I just saw Kendall do the same thing. Does anyone start sweating when you think about 3,000 feet with nothing that is holding you down? So, of course, this is pretty wild, and people who were even filming him doing this, they couldn't watch. A lot of people, they had cameras set up and they had their faces turned away because one mistake and he falls thousands of feet to his death. And no one has asked him to do this. It's just his own inclination. Scientists have analyzed Alex's brain, and many others are puzzling about why anyone would put themselves in such danger when it could be so easily avoided, when it's so optional. Alex's response, he said this: "You might get hit by lightning or hit by a car. Who knows? Every day there's a chance you might die. No matter the risks we take, we always consider the end to be too soon, even though in life, more than anything else, quality should be more important than quantity." Alex gets grounded in his way by getting on a rock wall. And Job, we saw, his first reaction is he hit the ground and got grounded in pain and perspective. He got on the ground and worshiped God. And we too can be inspired to get grounded in multiple ways when we're encountering pain. And this first way, inspired by Alex's way of dealing with this, is the acceptance that pain and death is unavoidable. The acceptance that pain is going to happen, that pain is a part of our life journey, and accepting that instead of dreading it or rejecting it might be a healthier experience once we do encounter the pains that be. I wonder if a big part of the problem of pain is that we think that it's something avoidable and that there's something wrong with us when we encounter it. As soon as we start to feel pain, at least especially for me, if I feel ill or nauseous in some way, I start to panic. I feel like something is off, something is wrong, something is broken, and it's this anxiety and this tension which just only exacerbate the pain that we're dealing with. I learned this week from my church friend Rebecca, who's in the hospital. She shared that she learned that chemo medications don't work as well when the patient is anxious or panicky. We know that being stressed or tense only makes things worse. Pain is a part of life. Pain is the first thing we encounter when we enter this world. And maybe accepting pain and treating it as something that can teach us something, not something to just be suppressed or avoided, this will help us move forward. Job is also someone who accepts what's in front of him. He turns and praises God, recognizing that this is all a part of life. He wasn't wealthy because he deserved it or earned it. He was wealthy because he was wealthy. And he knew that it was something that he could lose. He doesn't turn on the TV to distract himself. He doesn't turn to a drink. He gets real because he knows that all people will struggle. As Oscar Wilde says, the supreme vice is shallowness. Whatever is realized is right. Maybe the worst thing we can encounter is not experiencing pain. Maybe the worst thing we could do is experience pain and not let it teach us something. A second way we can get grounded in pain is through compassion and not comparison. Through compassion and not comparison. Often when I'm in a pastoral care role, when I'm visiting someone in the hospital or someone's having a bad day and sharing with me, the first thing they want to do after they share their problem is to say, but I know I shouldn't be so sad about it. There's a lot of people who have things a lot worse. It is good to have perspective sometimes when you're having a bad day and you want to have a meltdown over not getting the parking spot you want. It's okay to look and say, yeah, there's a lot of people having a worse day than me. But if we're not able to look at our pain and acknowledge it and have compassion on ourselves, it means that we're starting to do a ranking of what pain is worthy of pain. We're going to start looking at our own pain and saying, well, that's really more of a 2 out of 10, and I'm really only going to get upset if it's at least a 7. And if we start doing that to ourselves, then of course we're going to start doing that to other people as well. So if you go through a job loss and then are able to turn around after a couple weeks and get a new job, the next time someone else has a job loss, you might be more likely to say, buck up, buttercup. It's tough, but we all get through it. And instead, if we learn to have some immense compassion over ourselves, to look at our own self in the mirror and say, oh, honey, I know this is hard, we're a lot more likely to start expanding our hearts in pain instead of letting them constrict get tough and defensive, we can start to look around and recognize those who are struggling more than us and have even more compassion. We can be so grateful for the bottle of Advil we have and recognize that there are others who don't have the ability to get to the store or afford the pain pills that they need. And in a sense, we can recognize that we can relate even more than we were before to those who are poor and marginalized. It's not the wealthy neighborhoods where you see murals of youth who have been victims of gun violence. It's actually statistically proven that those who are poorer spend more money and spend more time on funerals. When we suffer, we can recognize that we have a community with the poor and marginalized, and we can reach out and find greater compassion. We can also get grounded in connection with other people. Connection instead of isolation. We can connect with God when we cry out in pain. We connect with others when we recognize that we need someone to make us a meal, or we need somewhere to crash for the night. We wake up and we cry out and we journal and pray and we get mad at God and we ask why. And that's okay, because anger leads to more connection. Job does ask why, even after this time of worship. And maybe it's not so much about the answer of really knowing, yes, I will understand why this happened. Maybe it's more about the asking and the power of connection we get when we reach out. Job's friends didn't really understand the exercise. They were sitting with him, and when he was crying out why, instead of just being there for him, they tried to give him an answer. And if you've ever tried to explain away someone's pain, you recognize that it's really not a good idea. And you recognize that the answers like, well, you probably did something wrong and God is punishing you, that does not go over very well. Especially if there's something involved with labor pains in some way or another. They didn't understand what C.S. Lewis writes in his book, The Problem of Pain. When pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge. A little human sympathy more than much courage. And the least tincture of the love of God most of all. Finally, one last way to stay grounded in pain is to take grounding literally. To get your hands and feet dirty, to hit the ground, play and cover ourselves in the dirt, get outside, get physical. I experienced that this weekend. I shared with a few people this morning and earlier in the sermon that I threw my back out the other day. And the reason I did that was because I was on a hike. I decided I needed a quick 24 hours away from Rochester, and I just wanted to go and smell that up north smell. You know that smell when you get above the Twin Cities and there's just that pine blast? So I left Friday mid-morning. I made it up to Jay Cook State Park after a few stops and was making my way around the paths that are still quite snowy up in that part of the world. I was having a good time until I realized that I'd gotten turned around, and towards the end of my hike, I realized that I'd gone half a mile in the wrong direction. And as I started to try and traverse back, I ended up on a new path, because I, like maybe many of you, have a bit of an addiction to the new paths. I don't like backtracking, which gets me in trouble. And so I saw a new path that seemed to be heading in the right direction, and I started to follow it. But this new path took me closer and closer to the edge of the very, very wide, deep, overflowing river, St. Louis River. And it started to get slipperier and slipperier. And I realized that this was not the most comfortable or fun hike anymore, as I would slip and fall, as I would try to go off path to get more rooted in the snow, but there were still parts where the snow was up to my knees. And the path suddenly came to a halt because the overflowing river had filled it. And of course, that overflowing river was hiding under another patch of snow. So, my feet being soaked, I turned back around and I got off the trail to try to find a new one. And that's when I tweaked my back. And all of a sudden, I realized how much potential danger I was in, because there was a small, steep path downwards with an icy bridge, and I recognized that if I became immobile in some way, I was still half a mile away from the swinging bridge. My phone was not working because of the cold, and I recognized that my very cold feet and the 20 minutes until sunset was not a good situation. So my answer was that I needed to get very careful, and instead of risking more twinging, I just got down on my hands and my knees, and I crawled my way through the slipperiest parts, and even though I was soaking wet, I made it back safely. But what was interesting to me was that I still hadn't encountered that up north smell, because it was still cold. It was still right around freezing. And so I got fresh air, but it was cold and not really piney. But when I got down on my hands and knees, the smell was there. There was moss on my hands, and I put it up to my nose, and it smelled like beets. And the bottom of the roots of the tree right by the river had pine all over it, so I finally got my smell. Friends, sometimes we just need to hit the ground. Sometimes we need to recognize that we have to just give it up. We have to let our bodies fall to the floor and give in to the struggle that we have. We can recognize that God is there to refresh us with new breath and new life, that we are never alone, that we will make it back to the swinging bridge. God help us all. So next time you encounter God in pain, remember, you are not alone, and get grounded. Amen.